police had his name from the very beginning. Women in the red light district had been warning each other about him for years. There was even a book, a handwritten book kept at a local drop-in center with his name, his vehicle, and warnings about what he had done to the women who got into his car. The police took that book as evidence in 2005. It has never been seen again. And while it was missing, this man was free. And while he was free, he raped 19 more women. On the 8th of May, 2005, a man was out walking his dog through Limefield Woods near Biggar in South Lanarkshire, a remote, heavily wooded stretch of countryside about 40 miles south of Glasgow. He called the dog back. The dog didn't come. He walked over to see what she had found, and when he got close enough, he stopped. There was a woman lying face down in a ditch. She was unclothed. There was a garrote around her neck. She had been there for a while. The man called a family member, and in the emergency call recorded that afternoon, that family member could be heard describing being in the middle of nowhere, with a body in the undergrowth, and no way of knowing who she was or how long she had been there.
I think we've just found a dead body. It looks a little bit on the top half, it looks naked. It's face down, blonde hair, I think.
She was Emma Caldwell. She was 27 years old. She had grown up in the west of Scotland riding horses, taught riding lessons in her early 20s, and had a relationship with her family, particularly her mother Margaret, that was, by every account, one of the most important things in her life. She had been missing for over a month, and the man who put her in that ditch would not stand in a courtroom to answer for it for another 19 years. This is Emma's story. Emma Caldwell was born on the 31st of January 1978 near Cardross in Argyll and Bute, a part of Scotland where the hills come right down to meet the water and where childhood can feel genuinely wide open. Emma's was exactly that. Her family described it as very happy, and every account of her early life paints a picture of a girl who was outdoorsy, active, and completely at home in the natural world. She loved horses. That is the thing that comes up every single time anyone talks about who Emma was before everything went wrong. She did not just love them the way children sometimes do for a year or two and then move on. She built a working life around them. She became a horse riding teacher in her early 20s, the kind of work that takes real patience and a genuine connection with the animals in your care. She was good at it. In 1998, Emma's older sister Karen died of cancer. Emma was 20 years old, and the loss broke something open in her that she did not know how to close back up. She fell into a deep depression, and a partner she was with at the time encouraged her to try heroin to cope with the grief. She did, and by 2002, she had moved with him to the Govan area of Glasgow, far from the hills and the horses and her family, and the addiction had taken hold in a way that restructured her entire life around it. Her parents, Willie and Margaret, said they were left in a blind panic. Margaret told the court, much later, they did not understand the finances of addiction. They did not know how much heroin actually cost or how Emma was getting the money to pay for it. What they did know was that she was their daughter and they were not going to walk away from her. So they drove from their home in Erskine in Renfrewshire to Glasgow twice a week. They brought food, they did her washing, they put credit on her phone so she could ring them, which she did every single day, often just to ask what they were having for dinner, how the family was doing, what was happening at home. And when she could manage it, Emma came back to Erskine for Sunday dinner. By the time of her death, Emma was living in a hostel in Govan Hill and funding her addiction through sex work on the streets just west of the city centre, an area the women who worked there called the Drag. Her parents did not know this. Margaret said she knew her daughter was a heroin addict, which was a terrible thing she worried about every day, but that she had absolutely no knowledge that Emma worked on the streets. In the weeks before she disappeared, Emma had been talking to Margaret about getting clean, genuinely clean this time, not just for a week or two. She talked about coming home. She talked about going to work on a ranch in America or Australia, somewhere she could be back with horses again, somewhere new, somewhere that felt like a real beginning. She had hope. And Margaret, who knew her daughter, believed her. She was last seen on CCTV at around 11 in the evening on the 4th of April 2005, walking alone on Butterbiggins Road toward Victoria Road on the south side of Glasgow. She was 27 years old, and she was trying to find her way back to herself. She did not make it. Emma's family began to worry almost as soon as the calls stopped. She normally rang every day. When the calls stopped after the 4th of April and did not resume, it was not something Margaret could push aside. She felt it before she could say it. "My husband never gave up hope of finding her," she said years later. "But I knew right away that Emma was gone. There was something inside me that knew she wouldn't go a day without phoning me." Willie refused to know what Margaret already understood. He searched. The family drove around Glasgow week after week, asking questions, looking for any sign of where she might be. They reported her missing to police on the 11th of April, a week after she was last seen on that CCTV camera on Butterbiggins Road. On the 8th of May 2005, the dog walker found her body in Limefield Woods. The pathologist who examined Emma concluded the clearly identifiable cause of death was compression of the neck, strangulation, either by hand or by the ligature found around her neck, or both. She had been in that ditch for weeks. She had been driven there by someone who knew the area well enough to choose it deliberately, remote, wooded, far from the city where she had lived and worked. After the body was found, the family went to the woods. They brought flowers. Willie and Margaret stood in the middle of a South Lanarkshire forest and tried to understand what had been done to their daughter and by whom. The answer was already known to some of the women who had worked the drag alongside Emma. It was already sitting in handwritten entries in a small book kept at a drop-in centre on Glasgow's south side. The police just had to find it and to listen to the people who were telling them where to look. When investigators began working backwards through Emma's life, they arrived quickly at the world she had been living in. The drag, the women who worked there, the network of people who had known her in the months before she died. And when they started asking those women what they knew, the same name came up, over and over again. A name that came with a specific vehicle, a description, and a very specific warning. Police worked backwards from the last confirmed sightings, speaking to anyone who had been in Emma's life and building up a picture of the weeks before she disappeared. That process led them, fairly quickly, to the women who had worked the drag alongside her. These women knew Emma. They had seen her, spoken to her, worked near her. And when investigators started asking about the men in her life, including the clients and the regulars, the women had things to say. Not vague things, specific things, about a specific man. His name was Iain Packer. He was a regular presence on the drag and had been for years. He drove a blue work van that the women knew on sight. What they also knew, and what they told investigators plainly, was that he had been infatuated with Emma specifically. Not just a regular client, but someone who had singled her out, sought her out repeatedly, and whose particular attention toward her had made the other women uneasy. They also told investigators what Iain had done to some of them. Rapes, violent encounters in that van, on roads out of the city, in places that were remote and dark and far from anyone who might help. Women who had got into that vehicle and come back shaken and frightened and warned their friends not to do the same. Women who had reported him to each other and to police and had not been listened to. At Base 75, a drop-in centre that supported women working in the sex industry on Glasgow's south side, the women had created their own safety system. A handwritten book they maintained themselves called the Beware Book. It contained vehicle registrations, physical descriptions, names and nicknames of men who were violent or dangerous. It was one of the most valuable pieces of intelligence available to the investigation at that moment. Iain's name was in it. When investigators seized the Beware Book as evidence in May 2005, a detective named Stuart Hall was tasked with collecting it. Stuart said later that he never read its contents. The book went into evidence storage, and at some point after that, a point that has never been properly explained, it disappeared. As of the time this documentary was made, the Beware Book has never been found. Iain was first interviewed by police in June 2005, the month after Emma's body was found, weeks after multiple women had identified him by name. He changed his story multiple times during that interview. He had no credible account of his movements, and the women who had pointed investigators toward him had described him as someone who had taken them to woodland areas in South Lanarkshire, the same general area where Emma's body had been found. Everything pointed at him. The women's testimony, the changed stories, the obsessive focus on Emma specifically, the geography. Investigators had everything they needed to keep pulling that thread. Instead, they let it go. Iain was interviewed and released. The investigation moved on without him. And one of the most avoidable failures in Scottish criminal history had already begun. In 2007, 2 years after Emma's murder, 2 years after Iain had been named, interviewed, and released without further action, police charged 4 entirely different men with her killing. They were held in custody, prosecuted. The case against them eventually collapsed. At least one received financial compensation for his false arrest, and the bill for this entire misdirected investigation came to approximately £4 million of public money. The 4 men arrested in 2007 were Turkish nationals. They appeared in court in July 2007 in connection with Emma's murder. They were remanded in custody while police built a case that Strathclyde police clearly believed was solid at the time. In 2008, the Crown Office reviewed the evidence and decided not to prosecute. The men were released. Amir Anwar, one of Scotland's most prominent human rights advocates, who would go on to represent Margaret for years and stand beside her outside Glasgow High Court the day the real verdict finally came, was direct about what this represented. He said police had spent £4 million pursuing innocent men. He said Iain had been known to police from the very beginning, had been named by multiple women in 2005, and had been allowed to walk away from the investigation while 4 other people suffered for a crime he had committed. Think about the sequence. In June 2005, women who had known Emma, who had worked alongside her, who understood exactly what had happened to her, sat down with investigators and told them his name. 2 years later, those leads had been abandoned and 4 innocent men were in custody. The women who had provided the most accurate intelligence available had been ignored because of who they were. After the Turkish men were cleared, investigators did not go back to Iain. They did not return to the women who had given statements in 2005. The case went cold, and Iain stayed free. Between Emma's murder in 2005 and his eventual arrest in 2022, Iain committed what prosecutors later described as 19 further sexual offenses or assaults against women. 19. Women who might have been protected if someone had listened in 2005. Emma's father, William Caldwell, normally called Willie, was a publican. He was a man who made the drive to Glasgow every single week to sit with his daughter in whatever circumstances she was in, not because it was convenient, but because she was his child, and that was what you did. When she disappeared, he refused to accept what Margaret already understood in her bones. He drove around Glasgow. He searched and kept looking. After Emma was found, Willie kept expecting justice to arrive. He followed the investigation. He watched police spend public money chasing the wrong people, while the man Emma's friends had named in 2005 walked free. He watched the Beware book disappear into a system that had no explanation for where it had gone. He watched the case go cold. He carried all of that for years. The knowledge that someone had done this to his daughter, that people knew who it was, and that nothing was happening. Willie died in 2011, on his and Margaret's 45th wedding anniversary. Cancer, the death certificate said. But Margaret has always had her own understanding of what killed her husband. Whatever it said on his death certificate, she told reporters after the 2024 verdict, Willie died of stress and grief and a broken heart. He was tormented that we had not got justice for Emma. It preyed on his mind. She also said, Willie died with a broken heart and he was so worried we had let her down that we hadn't got her justice. He had not let her down. The system had let her down. But Willie carried that weight as though it were his own failure for 6 years until his body gave out under it. The case might have stayed cold for the rest of Margaret's life. But in April 2015, the Sunday Mail newspaper published an article naming Iain as someone who had been questioned by police just weeks after Emma's body was found. It was the first time his name had appeared publicly in connection with her murder. Police responded by launching an investigation into who had leaked information to the Sunday Mail. Rather than ask why a man named by multiple witnesses in 2005 had never been properly pursued, they investigated who had told a newspaper the truth about their own inquiry. That investigation was later deemed unlawful by the courts. But the publication had an unintended consequence that nobody could have predicted. Iain read it, and he decided he wanted to clear his name. He approached BBC Scotland investigative journalist Sam Poling, who was working on a documentary about the case. He agreed to be interviewed on camera, twice. He told Sam he was not a violent person, that he had nothing to do with Emma's death.
I don't believe you've been telling me the truth. All the evidence that I've seen, and everything that I have learned, makes it clear that you are a sexually violent man
Not a sexually violent
who has
man whatsoever.
raped women.
I've never raped any in my life.
You told me you'd never been to the place where Emma's body was found.
Absolutely.
You've been there many times, according to
No, I
all
haven't.
the evidence that I've seen. The first woman you took to those woods was Emma.
No, it wasn't.
Those interviews were broadcast by BBC Scotland in February 2019 and later used as evidence at his trial. A former partner of Iain's told the court that after filming the BBC interviews, he came home as white as a sheet. He looked like he had been found out. In 2015, Police Scotland had been instructed by the Lord Advocate to reopen the murder investigation. What followed was the largest police inquiry of recent times in Scotland. More than 30,000 documents and statements gathered and reviewed, over 23,000 physical items examined, new forensic tests, new witnesses identified and interviewed. One of those new tests, carried out in 2021, produced the evidence that would prove decisive. A soil sample from the site in Limefield Woods, where Emma's body had been found, was compared with soil taken from inside Iain's blue work van. The samples contained the same types and quantities of pollen. The match probability was between 97 and 99.99%. His van had been at Limefield Woods. In February 2022, 17 years after Emma's body was found, Iain Packer was finally charged with her murder. Iain stood in a Glasgow courtroom in January 2024 and denied everything. He denied killing Emma. He denied the rapes. He accused every single woman who gave evidence against him of lying. Every one of them. 22 women, and his position was the same for all of them. You are all liars. The trial at the High Court in Glasgow began in January 2024 and ran for 6 weeks. Prosecutor Richard Goddard KC described Iain in his opening as a violent and obsessive user of sex workers with an unhealthy addiction to procuring their services. Multiple women gave evidence about what he had done to them: brutal attacks, rape, violence, an escalating pattern of behavior that the women who survived it described in terms that were consistent with each other across years and across victims. Iain took the witness stand himself. He admitted he had had contact with Emma. He admitted, in his own words, that he had indecently assaulted her and said he was ashamed of his actions toward her. But he denied killing her. He said, "It wasn't me who killed her. It wasn't me. I didn't do anything to her." He accused every woman who had given evidence of lying. All of them. Every single one. Prosecutor Richard's closing statement described the evidence as overwhelming. He listed 17 specific circumstances, which together, he said, prove that Iain had murdered Emma in April 2005. The soil match, the BBC interview footage and how Iain looked afterward, the pattern of behavior across years and victims, the women who had warned about him in 2005, the changed stories, the van that had been to Limefield Woods. The defense asked the jury to look only at the evidence and not at rumor or innuendo. He said consistency across women's accounts was not the same as proof. On the 28th of February 2024, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of murdering Emma Caldwell. Guilty of 32 additional charges, including the rape and sexual assault of 21 other women. 33 charges proven across 22 victims. 3 further charges found not proven. Lord Beckett sentenced Iain to life in prison with a minimum term of 36 years. He was 51 years old. He will be 87 before he can even apply for parole. He will almost certainly die behind bars. Outside the court, Margaret stood beside Amr and her family and faced the cameras. She said she could finally breathe again. Following the conviction, Angela Constance MSP, the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, announced an independent public inquiry into how police handled the original 2005 investigation. The inquiry is being chaired by Lord Scott KC and is still ongoing as of the time this documentary was made. Police Scotland issued a formal apology. Assistant Chief Constable Beck Smith said, "Emma Caldwell, her family and many other victims were let down by policing in 2005. For that, we are sorry." Margaret's response to that apology was quiet, entirely composed and completely devastating. Many of the women who gave statements about Iain in 2005, who tried to tell police what they knew and were not listened to, are themselves now dead. The inquiry will try to find the answers Margaret deserves. Whether it succeeds, whether anyone is held meaningfully accountable for the decisions that kept Iain free, is something only time will tell. Emma Caldwell was born on the 31st of January, 1978. She grew up loving horses and wild flowers and the outdoors and the wet West Coast days that Scotland does so well. She taught riding lessons. She had a sister she loved completely, whose death broke something in her that she spent the rest of her life trying to find a way through. She had parents who never missed a week, who brought food, did her washing, sat with her without judgment, because she was their daughter and they loved her, and there was nothing more complicated to it than that. She was 27 years old. She was trying to find her way back to herself. She did not deserve what happened to her. She did not deserve 19 years of a system that looked away. She deserved to make it home. That was Emma Caldwell. Remember her name. Leave me a comment and tell me what part of this story you are going to be thinking about. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until next time.